College football nerds, we are talking SEC championship game. We got Texas and Georgia in a rematch. I'm hoping, Josh, that we don't have these two teams play 3 times this year, but we said this was a possibility when they expanded. But this is an interesting one. I got Josh with me. He's going to get nerdy with y'all. We're going to talk about numbers. We're going to talk about models. We're going to talk about matchups. This is a fun one because we have more data since these two teams played. We've seen them play great, seen them play not so great. And Josh, I want to start with Texas beating Texas A&M. That game ended up being maybe ugly in the scoreboard, maybe ugly down the stretch. But if you're Texas, you're pretty happy coming away with a 10-point win. I want to start with a positive on Texas, and it's one that we've seen enough week to week, including last year, to know this. But it's clear to me at this point that Texas is not they're not an elite offensive team. In spite of all their Sark pedigree, 5-star city, all of that. But what they are elite enough at, and it might be enough for them to carry them all the way through the playoffs, is defense. Their defense is exceptionally good. Talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, when you look at these two teams and their statistical profiles, it's kind of interesting how they compare and what the perceptions are. collegefootballnerds.com, you could go to our website, look at a bunch of stats. We have relative performance stats. We look at how you did versus the teams you played versus how they did against everyone else. And those opponent-adjusted stats, Texas is 27th in rushing, 26th in passing. Georgia's, I think, what are they, 20 or 33rd in passing, and they're 56th in rushing. Neither offense is actually particularly good. But defensively is where they have an edge on paper. They're second in the country in our passing metrics. They're 7th against the run. I find it interesting, Daniel, that Georgia themselves are actually only 24th against the pass and 28th against the run in that metric. And that's why, we do a 1 through 134 ranking where we take every team, we have you play every other team in the country in our model, and then we look at your expected win-loss record. Texas is second in that metric at 124 wins and 9 losses. Georgia is actually all the way down at 16th. 104 wins, 29 losses. They're behind South Carolina. They're behind Alabama. And I think a lot of that has to do with the difference in defense. And I think there is something of a perception that still carries over. And I think Georgia fans will appreciate this because, look, Georgia fans, if you're listening to this, you've listened to us for a long time. You've been there, right? We get accused of being Georgia homers. I'm always accused of being a homer of whoever's really good at the moment because I generally pick the teams that are going to win. A couple weeks ago, somebody went through the videos this year. I was 11-2 straight up. That's kind of hard to do when you only pick big games. And I usually end up picking Georgia in recent years. Just like for a long time, I usually picked Alabama. And I think the first couple times I didn't pick Alabama in years were because I picked Georgia to beat them. And it's because, sometimes the favorite loses, but more often than not, they do win in this sport. Georgia, and I think their fans recognize, this year hasn't been the same animal. I mean, when you look at FEI, that's bcftoys.com. Brian Fremo is a great friend of the channel. You should go check out his website. It's a great stats website. Defensive rankings, Georgia's sitting down at 15th. Texas is first. And when you look at the opponent-adjusted efficiency rankings, Georgia is 0.53, Texas is 0.88. Now, that's some of that gets into standard deviations and complex math, but it is kind of fair to say, Daniel, it's almost like Texas is 50% better than Georgia is defensively. Tennessee's a really good defense. They're 0.68. Texas is a good 30% better than Tennessee defensively. Their defense is absolutely what's carried this football team. And it's not that the offense is bad, mind you. They are a top 25 offense. I mean, you can do the same rating, offensive ratings right now. Texas is 18th. Georgia, by the way, and FEI's offense is actually all the way up at 6th, which I think flies under the radar. But the difference there, Georgia is 0.43, Texas is 0.36. So again, you went from a 0.07 difference on offense to defensively a difference that's pretty jarring that it's 5 times that amount. Texas's defense is the thing that set them apart. It's the reason that they're 11-1. They had one kind of slip up in that prior game with Texas and Georgia. And maybe we can talk about that for a minute, Daniel. We often say every game's its own animal. The teams are different than they were early in the year. But that game, I think, was particularly kind of odd because Georgia only had 285 yards of total offense. Texas only had 259. Georgia had 14 first downs to Texas's 19 first downs. The odds of Georgia scoring 30 points on 285 yards are quite low. 4.3 yards per attempt is abysmal, 3.9 yards per carry. Texas's defense is the thing that's carried them. And then that one game, it was a series of events, be it, it was turnovers, it was field position. All those things combined to give Georgia a lot of points and give points pretty quickly in that second quarter that put Texas in a hole. But that game is something of the exception that proves the rule. And again, if you look at the per play statistics, that game does not suggest that you would expect Georgia to typically score 30 points on Texas.
We're talking about conference championship games. We're talking about playoff games. We're talking about the fact that this is the first year ever that teams are going to be hosting these games at home, probably higher ticket allotments. We've got a partner, a sponsor on this one that's going to help you find those tickets. It's SeatGeek. Josh, why don't you let us know what SeatGeek's got going on?
If you want to go out there and find a way to go watch the first year ever with home game, playoff games, go to South Bend, go to Happy Valley. SeatGeek is the #1 rated app on the internet for finding tickets. 28 million downloads, 70,000 events, anything from sports to music. If you go to the app, you can see everything they've got to offer. You can look at all the different events in your area. And if you think college football playoff, right here, anything you want to go to. They've got all the different events, all the different venues. SeatGeek, go look for the green dot. They rate the seats best to worst, 1 through 10. Green means good, red means bad. It's a great app and a great way to go see ball games.
By the way, you can use that app, you can use that website and preview what the seats would look like if you were sitting in them, which is a good way to help you decide which ones to purchase. And we came through for you guys. Use our code NERDS for $20 off tickets at SeatGeek. That's $20 off your first purchase with promo code NERDS. Make sure you click the link in the description and download that app. It's tough because I don't want to discredit that game because it was still a comfortable win on the scoreboard and it was on the road. So we can't throw it out, but I don't think that, it wasn't some situation where Texas's defense was on its heels all day and gave up 30 points organically. A lot of it was because of Georgia's explosive nature in their own defense. I do want to talk about something that has been a pattern now for at least 2 years, or let's say 2 years with Carson Beck. This Georgia team, not just Carson Beck, but this Georgia team is a second half team to a level that I think is really weird. Like, really weird. They get in big holes. They overcome big holes, or they just struggle against a weak team that can't capitalize, so they're not really down, but they're playing poorly, and then they turn it on in the second half. There's something there. It's not just me, and it's not just an anecdote. It's happened too many times for me to think otherwise. I'm going to make you do something that you absolutely hate doing and go on a gut thing and tell me what you think is good. One, do you think I have a legitimate argument that this is happening? And two, if so, what do you think's going on?
I think you're right that this is happening. And when you look at Carson Beck's performances, you look at his per game performances, they've been kind of up and down. One thing that stands out is that he's had his worst performances on the road. Right at Alabama, he had a pretty good day, threw for a ton of yards in the second half, but still only 8.8 yards per attempt. That game was a little bit weird because it ran long. Alabama got a big lead, let off the gas. Alabama also had a bunch of injuries and guys getting banged up over the course of the game. They were really, I think, playing like two freshmen on the back end when Georgia ran away from it. But in the other games, at Kentucky, 6.7 yards per, again, 4.3 at Texas, 6.0 at Ole Miss. They have consistently struggled to throw the football on the road. And when you look at the split stats, road and home, at home, it's an 8.7 yard per attempt team, 21 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. It's a QB rating of 171. On the road, they're a 7.1 yard per attempt team, 7 touchdowns to 10 interceptions, QB rating of 121. It's 6-6 split. Daniel, it's like a completely different team. Now, I know they played some of their hardest opponents on the road. I get that. But I think a lot of what happens is that Beck gets in these games. I think he is a bit of a gunslinger. Nussmeier's had this problem too. Everybody has. The new style of defense has a lot of disguised zone coverage. There's a lot of stuff they do to take away the RPO where they take DNs and they sink them. And a lot of people complain because the DNs aren't rushing the passer. Look, all that stuff's blown up the RPO because you can't at the snap. I don't know how many times I've said this year. You cannot decide where you're going to throw the football. You have to wait a couple seconds and see how people drop, because every other play is disguised. And if you predetermine your throw, which has been Alabama's problem with Jalen Milroe, he's very bad about this. You predetermine your throw at the snap, you're going to throw a pick. Carson Beck predetermines a lot of throws. And when he's early in these games on the road and the environment's loud, I think he gets a little bit mentally rattled. And he starts, the Texas game, he threw 3 interceptions, right? He gets turnover prone because he starts trying to force the ball in spots. He's not waiting for the play to develop. I know Cole Kubelik made the point with the Georgia Tech game, and I agree with it. The thing that won Georgia the game is that Beck was willing to take his checkdowns. And checkdowns are usually low-risk plays, and they move the ball forward. They try too hard early. Beck tries too hard to press. He's throwing without seeing where the coverage is, and the whole offense really suffers. And sometimes he's even a bit erratic throwing it. When he calms down, 1, and 2, over the course of the game, this is something I've talked about for years, Daniel, pass rushes tend to decline later in games because the guys get tired, right? Defenses get tired, and you tend to have more time to throw the football. How many times do people watch the football game where the first half is a defensive slugfest and the second half the points open up? And it's just because defenses get tired. And when both sides are tired, usually defenses get tired more than offenses because offenses rotate more heavily. But even when both sides are tired, it benefits the offense because you have more space to operate and reaction times get slower. And the biggest thing is it really helps the quarterback because he has more time to make decisions. All of a sudden, Georgia's offense starts doing really well. So I think Georgia has a problem with pressing, with the fact that Beck gets a little rattled on the road. All that is to say, I don't know, how much of that is a weird thing with Georgia, how much of it is just like Alabama. If you look at who Alabama's played this year, and I hate to bring them up as an example all the time, but they're such a Jekyll and Hyde team this season. It really comes down to, can you generate edge pressure or not? If you can, Jalen Milroe has struggled horribly. If you cannot, he can look pretty good. Georgia, early in the game, Mikael Williams is hurt. And I think they had they had at least one other injury. I think Jalen Walker was at least banged up in that game. Maybe I'm wrong. But I know Williams played, but he was barely healthy. They could get a ton of rush with Chambliss. And so, these matchup issues have become more of a thing, especially with these disguise coverage defenses. These defenses, by the way, having a bigger issue with option-based veer attacks because dropping players doesn't work very well versus the option. That's why Vandy and then Oklahoma at times have kind of popped some people. But I think there's something to that, Daniel. The question I'm going to turn around to you and say is, do you even consider this a road game? Because it's going to be in the SEC title, and this SEC title game has generally been dominated by Georgia fans, and this is a lot of the realities to the way the stadiums and the ticket allotments are set up, that while I know Texas fans are going to travel, it is probably... Look, Texas is going to be dominant for a long time because we're living in the NIL world, and let's be real, Texas and Texas A&M have more money than the other old school SEC teams, and they're going to buy tickets. But Georgia has such an inside track to tickets. I don't think this is going to feel like a road game for Georgia. I think it's going to feel like a road game for Texas.
There's a dynamic at play here that we talked about when the expansion to 12 was first announced, and I think this is the first place that you're going to see it. Texas fans know they're in the playoffs. Like, would you have any, if you're a Texas fan, do you have any thought in your gut that you might not be in the playoffs if you lose this game?
No. Like, you're in, period.
Okay.
You're in.
Yeah, Texas is in. If you are a Texas fan who knows you might lose this game and knows you might need to find tickets, shout out to SeatGeek, for a home game because you might be hosting in the first round, and you've got a limited budget because you're not Jeff Bezos and you can't afford 3-4 rounds of tickets, are you going to spend your money to fly to Atlanta and get a pretty expensive SEC championship game ticket? Or are you going to wait because you know you're going to be in the playoffs? Even if you lose this game, you know you're going to be in the playoffs and save your money for not having to travel and go to a game in your backyard and then maybe traveling to some more games of consequence in the playoffs down the line, including maybe a national championship game. I could see that having a huge impact on the crowd makeup in this game, and nobody's talking about it.
And the other thing I was referencing is the game's played in Atlanta, and the ticket allotments, the way these work in these games, the stadiums have a lot of tie-ins to season ticket holders and corporate vendors that purchase those boxes. And a lot of those tickets sort of travel to all the games played in those venues. I've been, I've actually been to Jerry World in a corporate box. Really cool experience. I don't know how many stadiums have a marble bathroom and then attendant with a warm towel for you, because of a corporate tie-in for a college football game. That corporate tie-in carried over. Well, it's in Atlanta. Those corporate tie-ins are all Georgia companies, and they're all Georgia fans. So every time Georgia's in that game, they dominate the fan base just because all the handout corporate tickets are going to be almost entirely Georgia fans. So the reality is this is going to be probably a pretty darn Georgia-centric crowd. SeatGeek, again, shout out to SeatGeek. If you want to go to the game, check out our sponsor. It's probably the best way to get tickets. But I also think a lot of fans if you're Texas or Georgia, the reality is you're looking at 2 to 3 more games if you win a national title, right? Like you're going to play in the original round of 12. That'll go to 8. And you got to play the round of 8, then the 4, and then so 4 games. I still haven't wrapped my head around that reality. I don't know that a lot of people have. Now, Daniel, I don't think a lot of people again have wrapped their head around the reality that if you are Texas and you lose to Georgia, you have 5 more games this season if you win a national title. 5 more games. It's crazy. But I think people are going to buy tickets because they're going to buy tickets for the here and now and not wait to see what happens. But I do think there's going to be an interesting conversation. And I'm just being honest if you're a fan listening to this. You may want to think about what game is the most important to you. Do you want to buy SEC championship tickets, or do you want to go, play maybe at a really cool stadium or have a home game for the playoff? Do you want to go to one of the big bowls or multiple bowls? It's an interesting question, but I do think that home and away split is interesting because this game was previously played at Texas. Georgia won at Texas. Again, a game that maybe is a little deceptive. And now this game is going to be effectively a de facto Georgia home game. And we've rambled on long enough about that for sure. People are probably going to gripe at us in the comments. But like and subscribe if you don't. But let's actually get back a little bit to the matchups because I think that's, there's still plenty to be discussed there.
So my question about the matchups is, whether or not Georgia is a first or second half team, a whole game team offensively, what we saw in the first matchup was Georgia really dominated Texas offensive line, especially in the first half. The game settled down eventually and didn't get crazy out of hand at all. But have you seen enough from Texas offensively since the Georgia game to make you feel like that was maybe a blip on the radar and they can put some numbers up on what has been admittedly not a vintage Georgia defense?
I'm going to be honest, Daniel. I haven't. That offensive line has not performed up to expectations. They had an injury too in that Texas A&M game. That's a bigger deal than I think people are making that out to be too. But since the Georgia game, that's 4.7 yards per attempt, pretty abysmal. Pulled the quarterback, put Ewers back in. He was better late, but again, everybody's better late because defenses get tired. Vanderbilt was 7.8 yards per. Arkansas 5.5 yards per in that 20-10 game. Kentucky was 6.2. Texas A&M even in that that win, it was 17-7 score because they were 7.8 yards per attempt, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. The exception was the Florida game, which everybody said, Texas is back and everything's fixed. When Ewers came back, Florida was out multiple corners. At that point in the season, had kind of given up, and Texas got up on them big with their third string quarterback, multiple secondary players out, and I think Florida just laid down. But it is, if you look at the stats, and I am right now, Daniel, is jarringly the exception. Since the Mississippi State game, which was the end of September, so we're talking the entirety of October and November, they've had 1 game at 8 yards per attempt offensively. 1. I don't know how you can look at that and not say that they have offensive issues. And it goes back to something I was mentioning earlier. FEI has their total rankings, but they have their offensive rankings. Georgia's sitting at 6th, and Texas is at 18th. They're behind LSU. They're behind Alabama. just a couple notches, right a notch ahead of USC. Daniel, I have a hard time arguing with that. I do think, to their credit, I think they're going to perform more consistently than a lot of other offenses, because I do think they have more balance between Ewers, and even with a beat-up backfield with a good running backfield, Wisner's been really good for them.
So higher floor.
Right, higher floor. But they hit their ceiling pretty hard a lot. And I'm going to do something you hate, because I don't have a good answer for this. The question is, why? Why do they keep hitting their ceiling? Because if you look at the pieces, they've got a lot of good pieces. Helm, Golden, Bond, Wingo, Blue. They've got Ewers at quarterback. They've got a really good offensive line. Why is this offense consistently hitting a ceiling? Why does it feel like they're somehow worse than the sum of their parts, despite the fact that both of us think Sarkisian is probably the best offensive mind in the game? I actually think he's better than Kiffin, because I think Kiffin has a lot of splash, but I don't think his offenses are particularly consistent, and I think they're a little bit of a one-trick pony in a lot of ways. We could have a much longer video on that. Sarkisian's offenses are more balanced, they're more varied, and they're harder to defend, in my opinion. But somehow that has not translated on the field. Why do you think that is?
I think it's a couple of things, and I'm going to make you talk about one of them because you get to be the bad guy. One of the things, if you look at Sarkisian has handled this better than some others, like Lane Kiffin and like specifically Lincoln Riley, where Sark's offenses have been varied because he's been an OC through different generations of the sport. You know, back at USC, Washington was a different type of offense was dominating the game. Went to Atlanta, that's a whole different thing. So I think he's a little more in tune with how to adjust. Lincoln Riley, I think it's proving at this point, he's not a great head coach, and he may not even be a good OC. He's just a guy who figured out how to utilize the RPO in the middle of the RPO era before everybody adjusted to it and kind of exploited that for a little bit of a time, and now he's been figured out. I think some of the stuff that was really deadly in Sark's offense at Alabama has been figured out. I think you saw this in the Georgia game. I think you saw this in the A&M game, in that you cannot let a lot of what Sark does pre-snap really confuse you, and you can't let a lot of these complicated plays develop, because if you give their offense time, it puts the second level of defense in a lot of conflict. I think teams are starting to be a lot more aggressive so that those things don't develop. And I think in some ways the RPO part of his game has been largely stopped across the board, not just at Texas. So he's in a little bit of a transitional space because he's got a quarterback who really came up in the RPO era. I think the other issue is, and this is where I'm going to flip it back to you with a question, outside of the things that I just said, why are you and I, and maybe the college football world at large, super comfortable with saying a lot of, let's put a percentage to it, 70% of Alabama's issues offensively are because of this common thread over the course of 2.5 seasons, and it's Jalen Milroe. But we can't bring ourselves to do the same thing with Quinn Ewers. Why do you think that is, and is it maybe your answer?
I think to some degree you did kind of give my answer, Daniel. So to comment on what you're saying about the schemes, I do think that's a huge part of it. Is that Sark for a long time was able to scheme guys open because he does a lot of stuff with motion. He made good use of RPO. The thing Lincoln Riley innovated was not the RPO. It was balancing in the power run with the RPO. It took a long time for other people to catch on to the fact that the RPO was effective, but it really had problems scaling against high-level defenses. The classic example we always gave of that was 2018 Alabama, who ran into an absolute brick wall. And then we saw that happen several other times where teams realized if you just bend but don't break, don't give up the 40-plus yard explosive passing touchdowns, that RPO offense will just kind of fizzle once it gets to your 40-yard line because it can't throw over the top. And the run game, because it's in an RPO, the linemen don't release downfield. The run game just isn't as effective straight up. Those linemen aren't taught to just drive a guy downfield. They have to play within 3 yards. They're always a little bit hesitant. You don't have a true power run. What Lincoln Riley did is he combined the two. He did a power run game. There's a lot of pin and pull combined with the RPO, And it took a few years for people to realize that was a thing. But by the time it caught on nationally, what's happened is everybody now has kind of gone from man coverage to zone. Georgia under under Lanning, and it's continued now under Schumann. They are now a primarily zone-based defense, and there's a lot of zone blitz schemes out of there. They do run some man, but it is primarily zone. They don't run the Saban pattern match man coverage thing. And the reason is all those RPO motion stuff gets guys confused. But zone, it's a lot harder to get confused because you have your zone. It doesn't really matter what they're doing. I'm going to take the guy that comes into my zone. And what that's doing, in my opinion, and this does segue into an answer to your actual question, Daniel, so I am answering the question, is it puts it more on the quarterback. Because zone defense is about your ability to read the zone, identify the hole in the zone, and know the route that you need to throw to. And the more you can understand those things and anticipate the hole in the zone, the better you are as a quarterback. And what we're seeing is quarterbacks that have a better feel for the game, and this is happening in college and the NFL, if you notice. Those guys are becoming more effective. Brock Purdy is not a super talented quarterback, but he's been effective for the 49ers, right? Why is that? It's because he has a good feel for anticipation and routes and understanding and reading coverage. Guys like Caleb Williams go to the NFL, and at times he looks like a total disaster. We just saw Daniel Jones get booted out. And guys that are super time talented, would kill 6 years ago when RPO was taking over and the passing games were more vertical and there was more man coverage. Those guys are actually losing starting jobs now because the raw talent that dominated for 6 or 7 years is becoming less important. The ability to read coverage and react to coverage is more important. And, Daniel, I think it's also devaluing to some degree high-level offensive coordinators because what ends up mattering versus these zone schemes is really fundamental passing concepts like high-low concepts, flood concepts. That is a basic read that's been taught for 50 years. And we're seeing the ability to do those basic, and I say basic, it can be pretty wide open, you can be spread, all that. But the passing concepts you're doing are less about how well can you throw the ball on the line 60 yards. It's more how well you can read it. Tennessee, I think, is suffering dramatically from that the past couple of years, that they're very difficult in theory to defend RPO with a quarterback that can drive the ball on the line 60 yards. Their offenses look terrible at times. Georgia, with Stetson Bennett, was all about reads and reaction, and he was not talented in a lot of different ways. Short guy, doesn't have, has a pretty good arm like a baseball player, but not an elite arm by NFL standards. People always get back to me with a random stat about his ball speed, but he's not a big ball, like long arm thrower. He's just not. But his ability to read and react to coverage quickly was what made him very effective because they were efficient. And all that to say, Daniel, Ewers has never been particularly efficient. He has always been inconsistent on his deep ball from the first year he was there. He's always struggled a little bit to consistently read and react to coverage. He's pretty good to the short and intermediate game as much as anything because he's pretty reactive and he's got a live arm and a quick release, which helps a ton in that situation. But I don't know that he's the best at reading and reacting to defenses. And so there's only so much you can do with that. And when you look around the landscape of college football, you look at the top scoring offenses. Miami, in order right now, it's Miami, Indiana, Boise, Notre Dame, SMU, Tulane. Ole Miss is 9th. Tennessee's 10th, actually, in scoring offense for the gripe I just had. You have this balance of RPO still kills teams with issues. RPO killed Florida. Sark's scheme destroyed Florida with backups in. But when you play better defenses now, it just doesn't take over. And I think a lot of that is Ewers and his limitations. And I will say a lot of it too, Daniel. A preseason, complaint I had, we got a lot of pushback. I don't know if people are going to agree or concede to it now. The receiving core is good at Texas. It is not what it was last year. Last year with Xavier Worthy, Adonai Mitchell, Jatavian Sanders, Jordan Whittington, and even like Jonathan Brooks from the out of the backfield, those were a lot of elite NFL caliber receivers. Helm, Golden, Bond, Wingo. I think Wingo will get there. The rest of this group are mid to late tier draft picks. They are not as talented as they were. And when you put all that together with Ewers, I do think it puts a limit on the offense. And I will say, Daniel, to end this long rant, which, again, if you like this, if you like these rants, like, subscribe, comment, tell us that. It's what sets us apart, for better or worse. It's what makes us different than what's coverage on TV. I like talking football. It's my honest opinion. If I'm wrong, I swear I'm not being a hater. It's what I see. I think the same's true of Georgia, Daniel, and maybe I'll let you talk because I've talked for 18,000 minutes at this point. But I think a lot of Georgia's issues in terms of up and down is they themselves, I think, are kind of limited at receiver. And multiple times we've tweeted, Arian Smith has become their go-to guy, and his entire career he's just not been polished enough. Every game he makes mistakes. He ran a wrong route in the Texas game and the Alabama game, I believe, both leading to interceptions where he's just not where he's supposed to be. I thought Dylan Bell was the guy that was rounding out that core, and then he got hurt. And so I think both these teams are good at skill positions, but they're maybe not quite as good as you expect. And in this new era of football, I think it puts a limiter on both those sets of offenses.
I do think that Georgia's wide receiving core, we've been proven correct on Texas and Georgia in this regard. Their fans didn't want to hear it in the preseason when we talked about it, or early in the season when we talked about it, but it's been absolutely true. You just cannot compare it to the number one draft city that Alabama had or that Ohio State had. I mean, even at Georgia, like, I know he was hurt a lot during his tenure, but a guy like Pickens, like, they don't have that guy there right now. So it's a fair point. I do think that offensively Georgia is a little better, but I also think Texas defensively might be a good bit better, to the statistics you pointed out earlier, might be a good bit better than Georgia. For all of the things that we talk about, that we hypothesize, we actually have data now because the season's over. The regular season's over. These teams are who they are. Texas is not a great offensive team. I do agree with you that their floor is higher than, let's say, in Alabama. Their floor is higher because there's enough pieces there that it's not just going to completely shut down. Their defense is elite. I don't think Georgia is elite offensively or defensively, but I think they're good enough on both sides of the ball to get a win here. Did you like that segue? I've got Georgia 24, Texas 20. This one's running long, but it's been one of my favorite that we've done this year. But give me yours quickly.
So first I want to talk about the model briefly because we never got into it. Now the model I think is less interesting because these teams have already played, which is why we haven't spent as much time on it. It has set this game 24-17, Texas over Georgia, 24-17. That's a 41-point game, and that's a 7-point margin. Vegas actually has this game a lot closer. Vegas has this at 2.5-point margin, 49-point over-under. So basically higher scoring, basically suggesting more than anything that rather than this being a 7-point game, this is more like 24-20, 27-23, that kind of thing. I tend to agree with it, Daniel. I think Texas's defense is good enough that it's going to give Georgia a lot of fits. I think Georgia has the ability to stretch the ball vertically. I do like the fact that Georgia's at home effectively, not on the road. I think this game is dead even. I think it's going to be a higher scoring game than the first one, or at least a more offensively driven one. Not that that's hard. But I do like Texas. I mean, I'm going to go Texas, a little ridiculous, but I'm going to say 24-23. Like, I like them by the smallest of margins. I think this game, much like the Big Ten Championship, which we also did a preview for, is absolutely a coin flip. I think it's going to come down to which of the two quarterbacks plays better today in that game. And both these quarterbacks have been up and down. And so fan bases are going to go back and forth. This video, I feel like, has felt fairly negative, but only because we've been constantly comparing the offenses to these relative defenses. And I do want to end on the point that the defenses are really, really good. I mean, defensively for Georgia, we mentioned, I think they've been a little bit of a bit different team when they've been healthy. They've been banged up. You know, Walker hasn't been healthy. You know, they haven't necessarily had Mikael Williams healthy. They haven't had Smile Munden healthy the whole year. And all those things have had an effect on them. But Texas in particular, I just think their defense is really, really stinking good. Their ability to stop the run is fantastic. When you look at Southeastern Conference rushing stats, they're third in the conference in rushing, but you know, the holding team's to about 3 yards per play. I think their ability to stop the run and control the line of scrimmage is going to give them a chance to win. I think Georgia will probably have slightly better stats than they did last game, but they're going to have lower points. And to me, Daniel, it comes down to the fact that Georgia, it's very hard to score 30 points with the kind of offensive production they had before. I think they get better offensive production, but I don't think they score 30. And if I just take one touchdown away, suddenly this feels like a Texas win.
All right, y'all. Let us know in the comments who you think is going to win this game, and let us know if you think we're right about our assessment of Texas's offensive struggles. If you have a different explanation, I would love to hear it. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.